How about that? That's good. I like it. But you're going to have to let me know, huh? Yeah, you're going to have to let me know if the batteries die, because last week they were all asleep and never noticed it. So, but I got extra batteries tonight. So anyway, we're glad you're here, and hope the first part of your week has been off to a great start. Couple of no, I'm getting to you, Sandy. Hold on. I'm gonna get back to you. Couple of announcements before we get to our prayer list. Our thanks to those who were part of our first Vacation Bible School workday a while ago. The next one will be this Sunday from 3 to 5, and they've already gotten off to a great start. If you came down the educational hallway, the cardboard has emerged again, and that's always a good indicator as far as Vacation Bible School is concerned. So take note of that. If you can, even if you can't come for both hours, if you can come for a little bit on either end, they would certainly appreciate it. But we've got several of these scheduled between now and the end of the school year, and then of course June is a blur because of everything that goes on, and so be mindful of that. Young adults and families, along with their kids, will be going to the. I always have a hard time with this one. The Trash Pandas. Yeah, I know you know who we're talking about. The baseball game, but it's just Trash Panda. I call them the Raccoons. Yeah, that might be better. They're playing Sunday, May the 7th. Tickets are $8 each. They're going to meet there at Toyota Field at 2 o'clock. And the deadline for that is this coming Sunday. So if you're in that demographic and would like to be a part of that gathering, then take note of that. Elders and deacons will be meeting next Wednesday night at 6:30 in the fellowship hall. So because of that, the media room class and the young adult class will all meet here in the auditorium. So that'll be in this Sunday's bulletin, just by way of reminder. Senior Sunday is coming up on April the 30th. We will be doing a congregational gift, as we always do. If you want to contribute, you can do that online and select Senior 2023, or you can pick up a donation envelope on the bulletin board across from Vaughn and Candy Enlow's office. We have 12 graduating seniors this year, and if you're wanting to be a part of that congregational gift, the money is due by the 27th. That's next Thursday, so keep that in mind. Now, as far as our prayer list is concerned, we were out of town this past Sunday, so I'm kind of playing catch up like maybe some of the rest of you. But the additions or updates, Benjamin Ellis's recovery continues to go better than expected, and he may get to come back to Gunnersville 2 weeks earlier. They'll know next week after an ultrasound. And for the benefit of our guests, Benjamin is 10 years old and had a very, very invasive surgery up at the Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, and originally post-op was supposed to be about 6 weeks, and he may cheat that by a couple of weeks and come home earlier. So we'll continue to pray to that end, and certainly that he will continue to recover. The other addition has to do with Sandy. Was it Monday or Tuesday? Monday. Larry Gray was taking the garbage out and suffered a fall and broke his shoulder. And they were to see y'all were seeing an orthopedist tomorrow and determine whether to operate or right. So, and that's usual as far as many of you have had those. You fall, and they have to wait for the swelling or the inflammation to go down to Did that happen Sunday in the auditorium class? It did. Something's just burning through the batteries. Anyway, we'll go with that. And but Brent, I don't mind yelling, but it doesn't work with it doesn't work that way with the live stream. But anyway, Larry will go to the orthopedic surgeon tomorrow, and then they'll decide what to do next. But sure, he's in a considerable amount of pain, and that's a tough area. But some of you know exactly what that's like. So remember Larry in your prayers. Others, Buford, anybody else? Okay, y'all had those two. But continue to remember those that are confined at home. Still have a lot of folks who are traveling, and we certainly want to continue to pray for their safety as well. Let's bow. Father, we are so very, very thankful for the opportunity we have to be together tonight. A very beautiful day here in the middle of another week. And we utilize this time as a time of prayer, a time of study, time of fellowship, and to share information about concerns that we have. In addition to the ones that we have noted from this past Sunday, we add to that our brother Larry Gray and pray for his recovery, mindful of the discomfort that he's in. And we pray, Father, that they'll be able to address this in the least invasive way, and that he'll be on the road to recovery as quickly as possible. Likewise for Benjamin Ellis and for his continued recovery, the very positive signs that he's showing, and that they might be able to return home earlier than expected. Father, we continue to have those who are battling cancer and are taking treatments, and we do pray for Dr. Mike Conrad, for Milla Sachs, for Neil Gunner, and for others, and that their respective conditions would continue to show improvement. We're mindful, Father, of those who are confined at home with illness, and that they too would know of our concern for them. Father, we're thankful for the opportunity that we have to study, and we pray now that as we go to your word, the truths and the insights that are there, we would incorporate, that we would embrace them and make those applications as you deem necessary. All these things we ask in your Son's name. Amen. We are in the 12th chapter of the book of John. And there, even though, I say this all the time, but even though John did not divide his gospel, nor did any of our biblical books, were not originally divided up into chapters and verses. I guess the book of Psalms would be the exception to that, and probably the book of Proverbs. Those were divided up, but everything else was a total block. But interestingly enough, there is an interesting dividing point when we get to the beginning of the 12th chapter of the book of John, and it has to do, as we've noted, with this dual development, the development of unbelief that we see, carried through the narrative of John's gospel, and we're about to see unbelief issued forth in its ultimate with the crucifixion of Jesus, and side by side with the development of unbelief is the development of faith, until faith will reach its pinnacle with the post-resurrection appearance, and when Thomas issues that statement, "My Lord and my God." That is when he finally comes to a clear understanding of what faith in Jesus actually means. And so in between that we have, and we noted last week in the 11th chapter, with that very familiar incident of the raising of Lazarus, the different degrees of faith or lack of it. And it reaches a very important level, and we noted this last week with the number of priests who are now following who are following Jesus at this point. And so what that does is it incites his detractors to the point. In fact, we see this back in verse 53. So from that day on, they took counsel how to put him to death. And what's interesting is verse 54, Jesus therefore no longer went about openly among the Jews, but went from there to the country near the wilderness to a town called Ephraim. And there he stayed with his disciples. Now the question is, why did he do that? Because he had just performed one of the most public, one of the most, faith-building miracles in the raising of Lazarus. But now, John tells us, he no longer went from there, no longer went about openly. To what do we attribute that? Oh, yeah. Oh, sure. And I think that's it. Brad said word got to Jerusalem. And it has to do, and I keep going back to this in John 10, everything that's going to take place over the course of the next, in fact, John tells us, verse 1 of chapter 12, 6 days before the Passover. So we can pretty well put together a chronology. But nothing is going to happen here unless Jesus means for it to. And so he's not going to allow them to kidnap him, covertly, snatch him and take him out somewhere and kill him and bury him somewhere in some unmarked grave. No, there's an intentionality, because we'll come back to verse 54. Jesus therefore no longer went about openly. When it says openly among the Jews, again in John's gospel, who are the Jews? Yeah, the Jewish leaders, right. Not talking about the general population here. He did not rub shoulders with the Jewish leadership anymore. So when we get to the beginning of the 12th chapter, 6 days now before the Passover, Jesus is back in Bethany. If he was trying to hide, this would not be the way to do it. Because he basically, in fact, John tells us where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised. It's almost like Jesus is returning to the scene of the crime, if you will. He's back exactly where Lazarus and his two sisters and a lot of, a nucleus of close friends were. And so there they made him a supper, in his honor. Martha served. Lazarus was one of those at the table with him. Now, what we're going to read about here in this paragraph, in the minds of many scholars, is paralleled in both Matthew and Mark's gospel. Matthew and Mark, in fact, both of them tell us that this was at the home of a man called Simon the leper. At least that's how he is, described in Matthew and Mark's gospel. Well, we would assume he was a former leper, and he was there to host this party or host this dinner in Jesus' honor, presumably, and it is, a presumption that Jesus probably healed him of his leprosy. It's not conceivable that a man with leprosy, according to the law, could not have hosted a party or a dinner. And well, he could have tried, but not sure how many people would have shown up. And so, but both Matthew and Mark give this description. Simon the leper is the host, and then we have some differences, different details that Matthew and Mark present that John doesn't. What we do not want to confuse this incident with is the one in Luke 7. The one in Luke 7 has to do Then he was at the home of a Pharisee, and this was the woman off of the street who came in and wept over him and wet his feet with her tears and dried them with her hair. Now that was, a distinctive incident there in Luke chapter 7. This is not John's account of that. This is completely different. What's interesting is in John's account, John tells us this was 6 days before. In Mark and Matthew's account, they tell us it was 2 days. And of course, critics and skeptics say, there's an inconsistency right there. Well, not at all. It's not the point of any of the Gospels to be exact chronologies. They're not doing that. Aside from the fact that as far as Mark and Matthew were concerned, you've got to remember during the feast of the feast of the week of the Passover, people could observe the Passover, numerous times. You weren't locked in on just a particular time. And so that's to be remembered. Another distinction has to do with the, John tells us that Mary will anoint his feet. And Mark and Matthew both, note that she also, anointed his head. And scholars do not view that as an inconsistency at all, because if Martha had anointed his feet, then at some point the gesture of hospitality would have been to also anoint the head. It's not a discrepancy at all. But in the minds of a lot of evangelical scholars, Matthew, Mark, and John, all three record this. Luke records something completely different, which is probably, I think, a credible conclusion. The other one, and we mentioned this in our Sunday morning class, is that John has already referenced this. If you go back to the beginning of chapter 11, what's interesting is verse 2, it was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. Well, John mentions this in the first paragraph of chapter 11, and it hadn't even happened yet. And so the question is, why would he mention it in chapter 11 as if the reader already knew, what was going to happen in chapter 12? Well, unlike where we are in this, you've got to remember that so much of these occurrences that happened to Jesus and by Jesus, they were passed around. There was an oral tradition before they were ever written down. And so John is basically saying in chapter 11, all of you already know about what Mary did. And it was so important because he puts it in its proper time frame in chapter 12. But he's assuming his original readers already knew about it. They'd already heard the story. And now he says, okay, this is how all that happened. They're at a feast, and Lazarus is there, and Martha is doing what Martha does. She serves. Mary took a pound of costly ointment of pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the ointment. So many interesting facets of this. Number one, and I don't know if the translations give any variation to this pound of costly ointment of pure nard. That seems to be pretty consistent. Nard, if you have a study Bible, you may have a footnote that goes into some detail. But why was it weighed up in that way? Why not just say, as Mark and Matthew say, an alabaster flask? Here, John says it was a pound of pure nard. I can remember, and of course, fragrances have kind of gone through a metamorphosis in our culture. The people are just not as big on that, I don't think, as maybe we used to be. I don't see the advertisements for that. I can remember when I was in, when I was in college a couple of years ago, there was a particular fragrance a cologne that college and high school boys were, everybody had to have Halston. Halston was the fragrance. And I can remember I would go into Sunday school class there at Mayfair, the college class. It would knock you down. It was so strong. And I'm thinking some of these guys had just bathed in it. And I thought, and of course I realize that's a generational thing, because before that, it was probably Brute or something, whatever the Old Spice would, that's even more, that's way back there. But I think before Old Spice, it was probably witch hazel. But fragrances have gone through a kind of a metamorphosis. You just don't hear that much about them as much. But I can remember when my father went. He went on a mission trip, and they came back through on their way back to the United States. They were in the Holy Land. This is 1968. 1969, and they had to change planes in Paris. And my dad got my mother a little thing of Chanel No. 5 perfume. It was a little bitty bottle, and he brought that back, and it might as well have been liquid gold, because it was real, thick and kind of like an oil base. Well, that's the kind of thing that nard was. We've got different grades, and ladies, you got genuine perfume, and then you got cologne, and then you got the other stuff that's watered down. That varies. That affects the price. That affects everything. Nard would have been a very, very thick consistency, extremely expensive. And we're going to see how expensive in just a moment. So Mary takes that, and it doesn't matter if it's Mark, Matthew, or John's accounts here. But one of the other interesting facets that Mark and Matthew record is, in order for Mary to do what she did, not just with the fragrance, but she had to take her hair down, which for a Jewish woman in public was a no-no. They didn't do that. Many of the veils, you can hear again that varied from Palestinian to Greek Roman culture, but Jewish women wore a full veil most of the time in public. The parable of the woman with the 10 coins, if you remember, those coins were not, those were not part of her grocery money. Those were the coins in the headband that was a part of her veil, and she lost one of those, and she couldn't, here again, this is a sidebar, this has nothing to do with the subject, but it doesn't, but she had 10 of those in that full headband, and if she lost one, she couldn't wear it. She couldn't wear a veil, then what? You didn't go out in public. And so, but even in a setting like this, where the women may not have been wearing veils, they would have kept their hair tied up. But she has to do that, which would have been, in some instances, a very risky thing. And she does that. John tells us that she anoints his feet and wipes his feet with her hair, and the fragrance was filled the entire house. Now the question is, and if you can read ahead and know where I'm going with this, the question is, why did she do this? Now keep in mind, in the context, we're still on the heels of Jesus bringing her brother back from the dead after he'd been dead. How long? 4 days. So on the surface, initially, one might think, well, she's doing this out of gratitude. I mean, how do you show your appreciation to someone? and in American culture, well, it's not just American culture, but it's especially in American culture, the depth of appreciation or the level of love is directly related to the price of the gift. And the more it costs you, then evidently the more you love or the more appreciative you are. And, the retailers and the advertisers have put that on the American public, and we have bought it, hook, line, and sinker. And the more expensive gifts are to be preferred. But is that what's going on here? No. How do we know? Well, a couple of things. One, what Jesus says. But John presents in fact, what's interesting, I want to go back and confirm this, in Mark's account, let's see, Mark 14, this is why John could reference this in chapter 11 and then put it in its exact time frame in chapter 12, is because one of the things that John does not record that Matthew and Mark do is, in reference to this, verse 9, truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is preached in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her. Now, what's interesting about this is, you read the whole book of Acts, what's not mentioned? This is not mentioned then. But Jesus wouldn't have said that had it not been factual. And so my point is, by the time John wrote his gospel, when, by the way, remember? Near the end of the first century. He was the last of the four gospels to be written, somewhere in the 90s, maybe early 80s, maybe mid to late 80s. Anyway, clearly 30 plus years after the other three, this incident, obviously would have been well known to the, throughout the church. Christians would have already known this, in fulfillment of what Jesus says in both Mark and Matthew's account. So, but John, in true Johannine fashion, he gives two different levels here. All right, everybody's there. The ointment is poured, and the fragrance fills the house, and John sets this up in verse 4 with the contrast. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, and then here again, John always, parenthetically says, this is the guy that betrayed him, just reminding the reader, who was to betray him, said, and this is the first time that Judas's words are recorded. The only other time, the next time will be when he approaches the chief priest and ask, what will you give me to hand him over to you? This is the first one. This is the first utterance. Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor? This, John said, this he said, not because he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief, and as he had the money box, he used to take what was put into it. Interesting textual reference there. RSV accurately translates that money box, but it was in actuality a bag at this time. Box here, the word that's translated box, originally was where they kept the reeds and the mouthpieces for musical instruments, of all things, in classical usage. But it came to be represent any kind of container, and so your translation may say bag. Box is probably a little more literal, but anyway, there was a do what? Yeah, that's it. There was a common container that the money that the group required, and for some strange reason, Judas was given that responsibility. And this kind of goes back to what we were saying a couple of Sundays ago when Jesus called his disciples, and we asked the question, at what point did Jesus know that Judas was going to betray him? And the conclusion we came to in our class was he knew it from the very beginning. Okay, then why was he given the responsibility of putting him in charge of the money? Because John says what here? The guy's a thief. And that in and of itself is somewhat of a character, there's a character issue there. So it's no surprise that he would sell Jesus out for the price of a common slave, because the guy was a thief. There's another interesting aspect of this that John does not allude to, that Mark and Matthew do, and that has to do with, let's see, in Mark's account, they're there, and verse 4, he doesn't mention Judas, but he says, but there were some who said to themselves indignantly, why was this ointment thus wasted? For this ointment might have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor. And they reproached her, Mark tells us. Matthew's account similarly records the same thing. And the indication is, Judas is the one that verbalized it, but what? There were a lot of people that were thinking the same thing. Yes, Keith is pointing out that the equivalent of that was, and by the way, it's not talking about a day laborer. A denarii was what someone on a full-time job would be paid, and so 300, it was a year's salary. Now, how we put that in modern day equivalency, I don't know. But then, to Andre's point, it was extremely expensive. You're talking about a year's wages. And but what the fact that Matthew and Mark and John, all three, record the reaction, not, as I said, Matthew, I don't think Matthew does. I know Mark didn't because we just read it. They point out what was said, and the fact that there other people were feeling, and then Mark adds, and then they reproached her. They criticized her for doing that. Well, wait a minute. Oh, Brad, go ahead.
The fact that there's this reference to his burial,
right?
John and Mark also.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in Mark it says she did what she could. Makes me wonder if she had heard the same thing that the 12 had heard. The prediction that he would go into Jerusalem, be killed, buried, and on the third day raised again. And of course the 12 were acted like they didn't know what he was talking about. Mm-hmm. But is it possible that Mary was the one person who believed him?
Yes.
And that she wanted to do this, anticipating that event just because of her belief.
Right, and I think that's exactly what happens, and because this is not something that was directly connected to the raising of Lazarus. Because look at what Jesus says. Let her alone, let her keep it for the day of my burial. Now, Mark and Matthew record what? She's done a great thing because she in other words, she understands. She knows what's coming up. And then Jesus says, verse 8, And we need to kind of look at this. We may not be able to do it tonight, but he makes this very broad statement: the poor you always have with you, but you do not always have me. Now, he does a couple of things with that. One, he lets them know that what? He knew exactly what they were thinking. You know, to say, why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor? And John, says he didn't care about the poor. He was a thief. Jesus puts it in its proper, in its proper category, and said, and he says, what do you think he means? Let her keep it for the day of my burial. RSV says, there's some variations, I know, but in other words, what? She's preparing me to die. She's preparing me to die. Because we know, and here again, Jewish custom was when a person died, they would normally, and there would be some variation on this, 5 to 7 pounds of spices were utilized. They were sprinkled in the cloth as it was wrapped around the corpse, 4 to 7 pounds. Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus are going to bring 100 pounds, for the burial of Jesus. At that, if that puts it in perspective. And so for her to do this now is I think, Brad, to your point, she knows.
For the custom woman, that was just to help with the decomposition.
Yes. Yeah, it all had to do with the trying to delay because they buried within 24 hours. But as we saw, we talked about last week with Lazarus, you opened a tomb, particularly if it was a community facility, it would be rather overwhelming. And so that was to try to do everything they could to at least minimize that in that regard. Yes, sir.
You have to consider this is an essential oil, the spikenard, and what she's put on her hair, what she's put on his feet and his head. This is going to last for days.
Right.
You just can't wash it off.
Right. Yeah.
That aroma is going to be there.
If it was enough, it was strong enough to permeate the entire house, then it's not gonna. You're not gonna wash it off.
You can buy a little bottle of 15 milliliters, and it's somewhere between, I don't even know the exact price, but say around $20. Now,
Right.
a pound of that,
Yeah.
you have no idea.
Yeah. Even on by modern, so back then even more so, and it's and this is the thing to say, and here again. In John's account, it's Judas, but evidently there were others within the house that felt the same way. What's the issue? Number one, it was Mary's to do whatever she chose to do. And if she wanted to break the flask and pour it out on the ground, that it's hers. It's hers to do with what she wants. And now all of a sudden there is this great concern. Nobody had said anything. Back up to the one miracle that all four of the gospel writers recorded, and that was the feeding of the multitude around the Sea of Galilee. And they took up how many leftovers? 12 baskets, right? The Gospels don't record anybody saying, let's take this back into the city and feed the poor. Nobody said anything like that. And so now, why all of a sudden this concern in Judas's mind, and evidently in the minds of others, this was wasted. She wasted it. Yeah. it's, and that has to play a role in this as well. I didn't hear in the back. What? They're the same people that saw the same thing she saw.
I think it's interesting that you get a little bit more insight into Judas's character.
Yeah.
And from the beginning, like, it wasn't just the single betrayal. And he was rotten well before.
And Jim just said we're getting further insight into Judas's character, because in Mark and Matthew's accounts, it was right after this incident that he goes to the chief priest and says, I can deliver him up to you for 30 pieces of silver. So yeah, and I think there are times when we try to minimize Judas's lack of character, because say, well, he just did the. No, I think there's a lot more. To your point, I think there's a lot more at work here. Brad?
Points out, people have, these people right here, they have motives that are somewhat self-centered.
Yeah.
They have attitudes just like us.
Mm-hmm. I think that's the scary part about this, because how many times have we caught ourselves with that same mindset? I mean, we'll look at maybe something that the elders will decide. Okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to, spend this money for this particular effort or this particular work, or maybe upgrade our buses or do something. And if you're not in agreement with it, the easy thing is to say what? Well, they're just wasting the Lord's money. That we need to take that and feed people. Now, the point is well taken, but usually if that's not brought up until something is done that you don't agree with, well, then it's anything but genuine. And Jesus' point in that statement, let's go back to that, verse 8. The poor you always have with you, but you don't always have me. You there, of course, is plural. Remember that in Palestine, during this time of Roman domination, the tax burden on the average citizen was 80%. So to say the poor you always have would have encompassed, I think it's funny to say that after, yesterday was a tax deadline, but 80% was the tax burden. So for Jesus to say, the poor you always have with you, that encompassed a lot of people. And I have heard that verse misquoted and misapplied in so many different venues, usually in the context of what? I don't want to help the poor. Why? Well, because, you're going to always have them. They're always here. Okay, when Jesus makes this statement, he's not talking about, and I see this every Monday night when I go to Huntsville, and when I come back, I get off the Parkway, and turn there onto Governor's Drive, and right there at the bridge going over Governor's, there will be an individual standing there, and they'll have a sign, and it's usually too dark for me to read the sign. It doesn't really matter. But I have to make a choice. If I get in the right lane and the light catches me, then I'm too far away from them. If I'm in the left lane and the light catches me, you look straight ahead. You don't look at them. You don't make eye contact, right? And that worked up until one night I had our oldest daughter with me. I made the mistake of taking her with me to class. That was problematic on so many different fronts, not the least of which we were coming back, and we're sitting there, and the guy's standing there looking at us, and she says, "Dad, that man is looking at us." I said, "I know, don't look at him." Well, that was too late. That's like saying, "Don't breathe." Right? She says, "You got any money?" I said, "That's not the point." She said, "Well, give him some money." I said, "Well, honey, I don't know what he's going to do with it." And she said, and I'll never forget it, she said, "Well, when is it ever wrong to do the right thing?" I said, "Well, you get out and stand there with him then, and you get..." No, I didn't say that. So we all have a wide range of attitudes toward that kind of thing. But that's not what Jesus is saying here. In saying what he says here, he is basically condemning Judas and anybody else that was so hypocritical in their attitude. In other words, he said what? You'll have plenty of opportunity to help the poor. That's a given. You're going to always have that. But I'm not going to be here much longer. Keith?
Do we know anything about the family of these siblings? Lazarus and Martha and Mary?
No, we don't know. Keith asked, do we know anything about the family of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus? No, other than the fact that they were a brother and two sisters. That's all we know. Now, you can get into some of the pseudepigraphal writings of the New Testament era, and you get some really bizarre things. But no, as far as the text itself is concerned, we don't know anything. They were affluent. We know that. He did. In fact, the times that he traveled into that area, that's where he stayed. Now, this is what's unique about this is because back in the end of the 11th chapter, Jesus was a little more guarded in where he went and where he traveled. Now, here in chapter 12, he's back in Bethany, and he's not going to be near as covert. Verse 9. Well, I tell you what, let's put a mark there, and we'll pick up here next week. Because what's interesting, and I mentioned this last week, is Lazarus gets drawn into the plot, and but what happens? This is 6 days out. Verse 12 says the next day. This is when Jesus will make his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Anything but secretive. And ask yourself, why a donkey? That's part of it. Yeah, Zechariah had already prophesied it, but there were several messages, not the least of which is my kingdom's not of this world. And the donkey was a visual of that. So, we'll put a mark there, pick up here this time next week. And the microphone stayed on. Yay!